Welcome to Ewtn's continuing live coverage of the Synod of Bishops on the Family. Week 1 of the Synod is coming to a close, and it is gathering serious momentum. We begin our show today, as we always do, by taking a look at what's come out of today's press conference. And to do that, and to take a look back at the week that has been, this first week of the Synod, I'd like to welcome into studio Edward Petton. Edward is the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register. Edward, welcome to the program once again.
Thanks for having me on again, Mary.
We had you on the very first show, so I wanted to have you on again at the end of week 1 to take a look back and kind of analyze everything that's taken place. But before we get into all the analysis of what's happened, what did you think of today's presser? Because the press conference for our viewers at home, that happens every day at 1 p.m. This is where we really get our main source of news from the Synod Fathers. So one thing that stood out to me was this idea that was floated to have local synods, let's say. So not just maybe every few years gathering in Rome from all over the world, everyone presenting their problems. They presented something that sounded like, let's have synods preparatory work at the local level before we get here. What did you think of all that?
Yeah, that was one proposal put forward by one of the Synod Fathers. So it's not sort of a general thing. And this is an important thing to point out about this Synod, is that these are proposals being put forward as suggestions. They're not sort of things set in stone already. So they're just being explored.
And we don't know how much momentum.
No.
I mean, so if you say one of the Synod participants mentioned it, you know, when by the time it gets to us, it sounds like it's almost a dogma or something.
Yes.
So, thank you for that clarification.
It's important to point that out. But he suggested something like having synods in regional parts of the world so that they can discuss what the situations in their region, and then those can be brought together at an ordinary synod and put together as a one block, as it were, in a synod like we have now.
That might make sense, because a lot of what they're doing is they meet in their own language groups, in their own country groups, and so if they did that first, and once they came here, they might even last only 2 weeks. We don't know, instead of 3, but we're at the end of week 1. What else stood out with you at the press conference today?
Well, it was quite interesting how I think there was more balance about this press conference. It was looking at the general congregations, the interventions this time, not the small groups. Okay,
that's right, because they had their small group discussions this week, and this is all now being presented, so they're all in one room together. The Holy Father was there.
Yes, yeah. And so there's more of a range of discussion. You hear more of what went on. And so this time there was talk about the need for mercy, of course, in the family, but also truth and emphasizing both of those things, and the need for conversion and so forth.
Yeah, that's the crux, isn't it? Because the church wants to figure out, how can we be more merciful without diluting the truth?
Exactly.
And this is at the crux of everything they're talking about this week.
And it's a real tension there, and it's interesting to hear the balance coming out in the press conferences now. In the first one of these kind of general congregations, it was a little bit more skewed towards mercy and only mercy. Now we're having a bit more balance, but there's also talk about families as evangelization, stress the indissolubility of marriage, but not as a burden, not as something negative, but as something prophetic for the church, as a witness to the indissolubility of marriage. That marriages are prophetic.
We're going to hear that a lot this week. That is one of the topics in part 2 of the Instrumentum Laboris, which is what they will discuss in small groups next week. So we're going to hear a lot about indissolubility, the sanctity of marriage, procreation. So that they already talked about it a little bit today is a sign of what we can expect next week. What else came out? I wasn't at today's press conference doing other things for interviews, but what else stood out to you?
They also didn't leave out the negative aspects, of course, of family life. Domestic violence and crime and all of that. So there was that too. So there was quite a balanced press conference as well. But also the issue again sort of cropped up of this sort of devolution idea of putting the pastoral practice into the hands of local bishops' conferences and sort of farming it out to them.
So that I would call it like a decentralization. So instead of the Vatican just being let's handle this, more things at the local level. But that can get tricky, right? Because if one of the problem is language here, and the language for some in certain teachings is what certain Synod Fathers would say nebulous or not clear enough, when you take that home to your corner of the world and it gets translated into that language and put into practice, this could lead to odd pastoral practices that Rome might not agree with.
Exactly, and so it's a kind of a loss of, if you like, of control really of the Vatican and of the Church's teaching.
But this might be what Francis would like, just, more
Yes.
collegiality, let's say, synodality.
Yes. But of course the problem comes with whether it's practice or whether it impinges on doctrine. And of course there's the big debate last synod and this synod is whether practice is coherent with the doctrine. And if it's not coherent with the doctrine, then you're going to get a lot of sort of an anarchical church, really, anarchical theology going out into these different regions. Which
I think we had
could be problematic.
centralization here in Rome, so much centralization, because as you try to enculturate the gospel into cultures all over the world, the challenges that can come from that is, you try to put it in the language of the people, respecting traditions of the people that might not have always been Catholic. And so I think some practices got, let's say, away from church doctrine. And so I think there was a centralization, but now they're talking about more of giving it back to the bishops' conferences.
And this is a real danger. I reproduce an interview translated into English by Archbishop Godecki, the president of the Polish bishops. It's on my blog on the Register website, in which he says, he warns that if 10 or 100 different doctrines are taught in the church, then she would break into 10 or 100 different churches. So essentially you'd end up with a sort of Anglican situation, which is what many people are concerned about that would happen if you did have this sort of devolved system. Well, so it's a very important subject.
It's a very important subject, and again, check out Edward's blog. Ed's not leaving us, I'm just saying check out his blog. That's another synod must to keep on all that's happening. I also have Edward on separately because we want to take a look back at the week that was. So this is a 3-week process. So we're on Saturday. This is the last day of their meetings. They get tomorrow off because, as Pope Francis tweeted today, he tweeted that on Sunday we should rest. I think he was saying that for himself and his synod fathers and all the participants. So to kick off our look back at the week that was, I'd like to first let you look at this small video package that we put together to sum it all up. The Synod event started off with a candlelight prayer vigil last Saturday in St. Peter's Square, presided over by Pope Francis. He called on the Synod Fathers to listen to families, including the Holy Family, over the course of their deliberations. Looking out onto the darkened square filled with candlelight, the Pope reflected on the symbolism of the candle in the dark in reference to the difficulties we face throughout our lives. The next day, he celebrated Mass in St. Peter's Basilica to officially open the Synod. In his homily, he once again set the tone for the meeting, telling participants that the union between a man and a woman is the foundation of God's plan for the family and a solution to the many forms of loneliness in today's world. On Monday, the real work began inside the Synod Hall. Pope Francis addressed all the participants in his opening remarks, warning against any politicizing of the Synod and encouraging them to give the Holy Spirit space to carry out his actions. The Pope concluded by reiterating that the function of the Synod is not to arrive at a consensus, nor is it a place of negotiations, agreements, or compromises. So what have they been doing all week, and who is inside the meeting? There are 270 Synod Fathers here and 48 other participants, including 18 married couples from all over the world, truly representing the universality of the Church. First, the participants listened to brief 3-minute speeches by some but not all of the Synod Fathers, and then for the next 2.5 days, they met in small groups to talk about Part 1 of the Instrumentum Laboris. There are 13 language groups, each with some 20 members. They have reviewed, analyzed, and commented on Part 1 of the Instrumentum Laboris and have come up with changes, additions, or amendments to that text. On Friday, the summaries of each of those 13 small circles were presented to the entire Synod body and then to the 10-member special commission that Pope Francis set up to draft the Synod's all-important final document, known as the Relatio Finalis. And you can even read those summaries yourself on the Vatican's website. Yesterday afternoon, the second part of the Synod's working document was presented to the participants, because that is what they will be focusing on during their small group discussions next week. Part 2 of the document deals with the vocation of the family, and this is where we will hear a lot of discussion on divorce, communion for divorced and remarrieds, natural family planning versus contraception, and couples who live together but are not married or are simply civilly married. Topics that are sure to spark lively debate. So that is our brief wrap-up of the work they've been doing so far. Next week we will talk more about that final document that we mentioned in the news piece, because that is what they're working towards. But now I'd like to continue my conversation with Edward Penton of the National Catholic Register. Ed, the Synod should the Synod affirm the proposition that national or regional conferences of bishops have the authority to make these pastoral provisions for local churches that previously have not been enforced throughout the universal church. Do you agree with this?
Well, I think that is going to be a real sticking point coming up. But this is obviously something that's going to be debated. It was kind of touched on at the last Synod, and I think it's going to become, especially with what's called the Cardinal Casper proposal for...
Explain that to our viewers at home who may not know.
Okay, well that is essentially what he calls a penitential period, where divorced and remarried Catholics go through a penitential period after which they can receive Holy Communion. Now, that is problematic because people say, well, the first marriage still exists.
Right.
So the church has
they're
always
living in
believed
adultery. This couple's living in adultery,
yeah.
But how do we get them back to the sacraments? And
Yes.
that's what they're grappling with.
Yeah. And this penitential period doesn't necessarily cater for dealing with that. There is a unique cases where divorced and remarried people can go to Holy Communion if they live as brother and sister, if they live in continence.
Even if they are married but living chastely.
And they don't give scandal to those
Josephite.
in the parish. But this is different to that, and this is what's causing a lot of problems. Now, if that's sort of farmed out to the local churches, and it's left to the bishop to decide, or the priest, then that could lead to problems, because it touches on doctrine.
It touches on doctrine, not just pastoral
exactly.
practice. So we have just a minute before we have to take a break. What do you make of what Cardinal Tagle said yesterday, just quickly? He called the Instrumentum Laboris a martyr document. Is that something negative, or can you explain what he meant by that?
Well, the Instrumentum Laboris, it has to be said, has come in for quite a bit of stick since it got put out there. And there was one small group, English working group, that called it a flawed, inadequate, especially in its theology, lacking in clarity, trust in the power of grace.
This was English Group D. Yeah,
this was
very
strong.
famous, right?
And they said it sort of prompted pastoral despair. So, this is a really problematic document for some people. So, and this is the basis, the working text that the Synod Fathers are working on. So there's going to be a lot of amendments tabled to try and change this document to make it more broad and relevant.
We'll see if it's martyred or not by the end of the Synod process. We have to take a break, but stay tuned for more live Synod coverage from Rome. When we come back, we have more conversation with Edward Penton, and we also hear from Cardinal DiNardo, so stay tuned. The Synod Fathers are hard at work while they are here for these 3 weeks, and we are always thankful when they can take a few minutes to answer our questions for you, the viewers at home. We caught up with Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, Archbishop of Galveston, Houston, Texas, to ask him to comment on Cardinal Tagle's comments that the Instrumentum Laboris, the document that is the basis for the Synod, must be willing to be martyred, as Cardinal Tagle said, to give rise to the final document, a comment that got a lot of reaction in the press.
Cardinal Tagle has a very imaginative way of saying things, and I would not want to touch what he has to say. I would probably phrase it more as an Anglo-Saxon and say, yeah, you've got to rework the document. There are spaces in it that are very good, but there are other spaces that are less coherent, and we really need to do some cleaning up, making things clear. Well, that's typically American, isn't it? Let's make it clear one thing after another. You have to remember that all of our work is based on what they call the Instrumentum Laboris, that is, the working document. So the small language groups are actually taking that document apart, as it were, looking at the points that it raises, seeing if they circulate with us well, where are there good points, where there's omissions. And so I have found that working with the English language bishops on the document has been very productive. We obviously have some interest where we come from throughout the world. My group has people from all over the world, whether from Africa, we have Eastern Rite bishops, we obviously have America and Canada, so we have a wide range of people and therefore points of view, so that's always good to hear.
The last question we put to Cardinal DiNardo was about young people and the hesitation they might have about taking that big step to get married. Here's what he had to say.
Well, first of all, I think the sacrament of marriage, family life, is one of the more beautiful dimensions of the faith, of the church, and of the world. I cannot imagine anything more beautiful than that kind of commitment. Falling in love is one thing, staying in love is even better. So I would suggest to our young people that even as they look for true happiness, they will discover it most in the friendship and in the depths of the sacrament of marriage and family life.
Our thanks again to Cardinal DiNardo for his time. I'm back on set with Edward Penton. We want to go through the week that was, this week that we have experienced together for the first week of the Synod. You're a veteran journalist here in Rome, Edward, and I wanted to ask you, we've been talking before about the small working groups. This is what they do. They get a chunk of the Instrumentum Laboris, they break up into their language groups, discuss it, and so on. Yeah. It's been very positive, it seems. There's been a whole range of discussion, and the diversity is quite great. Do you agree?
Yeah, and I think they all welcome this because I think Archbishop Kurt said, when I interviewed him at the beginning of the week, that they get a bit bored of the sort of general discussions. So it's nice to have this sort of low, these smaller groups of 20 or so Synod Fathers, one together. Also, although they're the same language groups, they're also from different parts of the world. So you've got got Africans within the same language group. You've got others from different parts.
Australia, for English, exactly. Australia, England, Asia, India, even. Wherever, right.
Yeah, so you've got these whole wealth of different perspectives coming together, and they really like that. And I've always found that with synods, that's always what they say, is they love the international aspect of it, the bringing together of the universal church into one spot and hearing everybody else's experiences. And that's very fruitful, I think, in whatever synod they have.
That's great. What do you think about Cardinal Erdo's participation this week in the synod?
Well, I mean, that got the synod off to quite a bang, really, because people were wanting to have a certain amount of, reasserting of church teaching in many areas, especially with marriage and the family after the past year or two. And he kind of did that with his relatio. Unfortunately, got a bit pushed back by some people, which people didn't like because he's kind of set the tone. I mean, they said it's just one other piece. It's one of the
downplayed it a little bit,
and people saying no, this is good. We need this, and you heard this coming back in the small groups too, and other places. So. So that was how.
What do you think about the transparency of the media coverage? And do you think there's any filtering going on? I mean, is this as transparent as it could be?
Well, this is the problem. I think because the Pope, in order to have this sort of open discussion, he thought it was a good idea to have these interventions made without being attributed, so that people could be free to say what they wanted. And you can understand his rationale there. That if they want to be free, then it's best that we don't know what they're saying, essentially.
I would like that too. I mean, I'd say even just in a meeting, if somebody really wants to know what I think, I'd rather not have it on Twitter and published to stay on the internet for life. Speak from the heart. I get it.
But there are problems with that, and one of them is that you could have all of these summaries printed out without any names, which would be one way to do it.
Yeah.
But instead, we're getting these very short summaries put to us by the different language relators, and that is problematic because you're only getting
summarizing it.
So you're getting it filtered through them, really. And what we found out this week is that the Polish bishops released who said what early on, and so you did see who was saying what, and you could compare.
They were saying, but not themselves. They were saying which cardinal that wasn't themselves, and so I think they put the kibosh on that. Like they did. Said, you can publish what you said, but maybe not.
But what it served to show was how the discrepancy between what we were being told by the relators and what was actually happening in the Synod Hall. And unfortunately, there was quite a discrepancy, so we weren't getting all the information that we could have got.
Where did you notice it most, that, like, say, a discrepancy, just for an example, if you can think of one? I know we're here live and on the set, but what else?
Well, I think there was a great emphasis on, well, I think on homosexuality, which is only brought up a couple of times apparently. But in fact, there were other issues too, and there was one which was, talking about the need for justice and truth, the need for scripture and tradition. You didn't hear those in the Synod, in the press office. So there was a...
Right. And there's quite an emphasis on scripture and tradition and all of that we're not hearing about. And hopefully we will do now, because they're going to analyze marriage this week, as I say, with a capital M. I mean, they're really getting into the heart of married life this week. So we could hear more about that. You know what, I haven't heard a lot about this Synod, and I haven't even seen it, Cardinal Casper and the German group. And what is going on there, and why haven't we heard anything from them?
No, I mean, again, it's partly because of this confidentiality. We don't know who said what. But I think also when we get into the doctrine areas next week and the week after, I think we might start hearing a bit more from that group. But we'll have to wait and see for that.
Do you notice any other groups who are really making an influence? I've enjoyed the African groups, togetherness, their joy, and the clarity of their message, for example.
And the Africans are actually very positive about this Synod. Cardinal Napier thought the small groups were excellent, and I think they feel they're getting properly heard.
Yes.
They're not being sidelined in any way.
Right, it's not so Eurocentric anymore, Western-centric, which was a criticism. I know that the German bishops yesterday said in their language circle that the language in general should be adapted to the culture, and that can include the gospel as well. I mean, do you think this enculturation of the gospel at the local level is something to keep our eye on?
Yes, definitely, yes. I think that's key, and that's something that the synods are very good at doing, is trying to do that, and so that bishops have things to take back to their own diocese, which is new and innovative. Yeah.
Following reports that Pope Francis might not issue a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, a final papal summary given after a synod, Cardinal Tagle reminded reporters that post-synodal apostolic exhortations, as they're called, haven't always been common practice. And the first synods of Paul VI didn't end with such a document, for example. Edward, this idea that we might not even have a post-synod document after all is leading some to ask the question, well, what's this all about then?
Well,
we've been meeting for 2 synods. We've had a year in between, a lot of reflection. Questionnaires have been sent out to local dioceses to get input from families. And the Pope could either just take this final document and keep it for his personal reflection, or it could turn into what's called this apostolic exhortation, which has, has its own weight and influence on the Church.
Yes. Well, this is it. It's also not clear whether there's going to be actually a final report as well. I mean, there will be a final report. It's just whether we'll actually see it. There's going to be a vote on that. That's going to be sent to the Holy Father, and it's up to him if he wants to publish it. So he may not publish that. He may not give a post-synodal apostolic exhortation either.
But with the family needing so much direction, but maybe this will be taken home to the bishops' conferences around the world, and then they'll deal directly maybe with the families, come up with their own documents.
This is the possibility, and this is what we were going back to earlier about the devolving to the bishops' conferences. But that could be very problematic, and I don't think the Synod Fathers, I can't speak for all of them, of course, but I think there'll be quite a bit of opposition to that, because they're concerned about this doctrinal element getting into that sort of mechanism.
Exactly. Well, what do you think we're going to see in the week ahead? So we're at the end of the week 1. We've kind of analyzed everything that they've talked about and discussed. As we look ahead to next week, what are some predictions you may have about what could be problematic or what could be great?
Well, I think they're moving on now to, at least in the small groups, to the second part of the Instrumentum Laboris, and then they're also going to go into the third part in the general congregations, which is more doctrinal. So you're going to get into the nitty-gritty.
So the more fireworks might be in week 3, as we say.
And they're doing that early on because these issues are obviously more complex. They need a lot more discussion, so they want more time for that. So they're going to give, 2/3 of the synod to that, rather than as before they were going to do sort of half and half. Now it's going to be, they're moving it along a bit to cater for all of that. Yeah.
Well, before we end the show, I just want to run quickly a clip. I want you to meet the youngest member of the Synod, the youngest Synod Father, and he's only 4 months old.
We are Massimo and Patrizia Poloni, a family of the New Catechumenal Way, and on a mission in Holland for 11 years. We have 12 children. The oldest is 19 years old, and this one with us is 3 months old. The cardinals named him the newborn of the Synod. I believe that he is the first toddler to enter the Synod Hall. We are very thankful to the Holy Father to have given us the possibility to be here.
We hope that with this synod, the beauty of the Christian family can be rediscovered. There are many Christian families who live happily and in fidelity within their marriage and have the joy of having a house full of children. All of that despite our difficulties. We are simple people, weak, and with our own struggles.
I wanted you to meet the youngest Synod father, 4 months old, and his family. They are there every day with their little baby, and the baby's even been blessed by Pope Francis. I just wanted to thank Edward Penton again for being on our show this evening, the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register. You can follow his blog and follow all of his articles online. And that's our show for this evening. Remember, for all the latest information on the Synod, visit our special Synod page on EWTN.com and follow us on Twitter at EWTN. Send us your comments and questions using the hashtag EWTN Synod. We're covering this from all angles, so make sure you watch EWTN News Nightly. Log on for our blog by Joan Lewis, Rome Bureau Chief, and don't miss The World Over each Thursday as the Papal Posse brings you the latest from Rome. I'm Mary Shovlin. Good night from the Eternal City.